It happened quietly at first. No dramatic press conference, no flashing lights on the steps of the courthouse, just a ruling. A few pages released by the Supreme Court instantly sent shockwaves through Washington, Wall Street, and every corner of the political world. The words were clinical, restrained, almost cold. But the meaning was unmistakable. The Trump Organization, as it has existed for decades, was ordered to be completely dissolved. For a moment, the noise stopped. Cable news anchors paused mid-sentence. Analysts stared at their screens. Even longtime Trump allies struggled to process what they were seeing. This was not a fine. This was not a temporary restriction. This was the court drawing a final line and saying this entity cannot continue. Within minutes, headlines exploded across the internet. Social media lit up with disbelief, celebration, outrage, and confusion. Supporters called it political persecution. Critics called it accountability long delayed. But everyone agreed on one thing: this was unprecedented. The Trump Organization was not just a business. It was a symbol, a brand intertwined with politics, power, and personal identity. To order its dissolution was to strike at something far larger than buildings and balance sheets. It was the legal system asserting dominance over a name that had spent years testing its limits. Then came the second shock. While politicians scrambled to react, one voice cut through the chaos with calm precision. Warren Buffett, no shouting, no partisan spin, just a measured response that immediately reframed the moment. Buffett did not talk about Trump. He talked about rules, about markets, about what happens when institutions finally enforce standards that everyone claims to respect but few expect to be applied evenly. That contrast mattered. Trump's world thrives on spectacle. Buffett's world runs on credibility. And when Buffett speaks during moments like this, investors listen, regulators listen, and history tends to take notes. This was no longer just a legal ruling. It was a signal. A message that power has limits. Brands are not shields, and even the most defiant empires can be dismantled when the system decides it has had enough. And this was only the beginning. To understand why the Supreme Court took such a drastic step, we need to rewind the clock and trace the series of decisions, investigations, and controversies that led to this moment. The Trump Organization had long operated in the intersection of business and politics, but over the years, scrutiny intensified. From tax investigations to allegations of misleading lenders, from lawsuits over financial disclosures to civil claims challenging the accuracy of reported assets. Each legal threat on its own might have seemed manageable, but together they formed a web that no court could ignore. Investigators meticulously documented discrepancies, tracing patterns of alleged misconduct across years. Real estate transactions, corporate filings, and financial statements were dissected line by line. Legal teams for both the state and private parties argued that the organization's structure allowed for repeated misuse and that the repeated violations indicated systemic problems rather than isolated mistakes. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, lower courts had already issued findings that painted a troubling picture. Judges noted patterns of misrepresentation, internal communications that raised red flags, and financial practices that skirted legal boundaries. Appeals had been filed, delayed, and argued. Trump's legal team fought fiercely, citing precedent, technicalities, and the economic impact of such a ruling, but the courts were increasingly unconvinced. What made this situation extraordinary was not just the legal merit, it was the sheer scale and visibility. Every argument, every filing, every motion was dissected publicly, analyzed in the media, and debated by legal scholars. Unlike typical corporate dissolution cases, this one carried enormous political weight. Decisions here were never purely about accounting errors or procedural missteps. They were about accountability at the highest level, and about whether the law could reach an entity synonymous with a former president. Even outside the courtroom, the pressure mounted. Investors were anxious, partners wary, and the media relentless. The organization's brand, once seen as untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. And as the Supreme Court prepared to make its final decision, it became clear that history might not look kindly on those who assumed wealth, fame, and political influence were beyond scrutiny. This was not just another legal battle. This was a reckoning, a moment when long-standing power met the full force of the judicial system, and the world waited to see if even the most fortified empire could stand against it. When the Supreme Court released its ruling, the language was precise, unflinching, and legally airtight. The justices did not rely on dramatic rhetoric. They relied on facts, precedent, and careful interpretation of the law. The court stated that the Trump Organization had repeatedly misrepresented its assets and financial status in ways that violated corporate and civil regulations. Importantly, the justices emphasized that these patterns were not accidental or minor. They reflected systemic issues embedded in the company's structure. The ruling went beyond fines or restrictions. The court concluded that the organization's current structure was inherently incapable of operating within the law without continuing violations. That assessment left only one remedy: full dissolution. By ordering the company to cease operations and liquidate assets, the court sent a clear message that legal safeguards would not tolerate ongoing misconduct, regardless of political influence or public visibility. Legal analysts immediately noted the historical weight of this decision. Corporate dissolutions of this magnitude are rare, especially when tied to politically prominent figures. The justices had to balance numerous factors: the impact on employees, creditors, and partners, alongside the principle that no individual or entity is above the law. By framing the dissolution as both corrective and preventive, the court ensured the ruling would resonate far beyond Trump's business empire. The decision also outlined oversight mechanisms. Courts will monitor the liquidation process to ensure assets are distributed appropriately and that no component of the organization continues business under misleading pretenses. Trustees will be appointed, reports submitted regularly, and financial records scrutinized for compliance. This is not merely a punishment, it is a structural reset. Immediately after the ruling, the legal community dissected the implications. If upheld, this decision sets a precedent for how courts can intervene in large corporations where leadership demonstrates repeated violations of law. It signals that reputation, political connections, or brand strength cannot shield executives from accountability. For Trump, the decision was devastating. It effectively dismantled a core source of wealth, influence, and leverage. For observers, it was a landmark moment, proof that even the most powerful organizations are ultimately subject to the rule of law. And for the public, it was a vivid illustration that the courts can act decisively when systemic wrongdoing is proven, regardless of the fame or political stature of those involved. The moment the Supreme Court ruling hit, the world outside the courtroom erupted. Financial markets, which had been quietly monitoring the case, responded almost immediately. Stocks tied to Trump Organization projects, luxury real estate ventures, and affiliated holdings saw sharp drops. Analysts scrambled to evaluate the broader economic ripple effects. The consensus was clear. The dissolution wasn't just symbolic, it would directly impact investors, partners, and markets tied to the empire. Media outlets ran nonstop coverage. Cable news channels interrupted regular programming to break down the ruling line by line, with legal analysts, former prosecutors, and corporate watchdogs weighing in. Headlines screamed about accountability, unprecedented judicial intervention, and the fall of a business empire that had long been intertwined with politics. Social media, of course, exploded. Supporters decried what they called political persecution, while critics celebrated a long overdue demonstration of justice. Memes, viral clips, and threads dissecting the ruling spread like wildfire. Warren Buffett, ever the voice of measured perspective, quickly entered the conversation. Unlike the sensationalized coverage elsewhere, Buffett framed the issue in terms of business principles: transparency, responsibility, and long-term sustainability. His comments emphasized that no matter how large or famous, companies that repeatedly skirt legal boundaries cannot survive indefinitely. Buffett didn't attack Trump personally, but the implication was unmistakable. The law catches up with even the most high-profile entities eventually. Corporate boards and partners connected to the organization began making rapid calculations. Some moved to distance themselves immediately, worried that association could risk reputational harm or legal exposure. Law firms, lenders, and investors reassessed contracts and contingency plans, preparing for an inevitable liquidation process. The media and market reactions were not just about shock value, they reinforced the Supreme Court's message. It was clear to everyone watching that the dissolution was irreversible, far-reaching, and a demonstration of institutional authority. It sent a warning not only to Trump, but to any company or individual thinking fame, political influence, or branding could place them above the law. By the end of the first day, the story had dominated headlines, trending topics, and conversations in boardrooms, living rooms, and social media feeds across the country. The world had seen a legal hammer fall, and it was impossible to ignore the magnitude of what had just happened. As the Supreme Court ruling spread across news networks, Trump reacted quickly and predictably with a mix of outrage, defiance, and media theatrics theatrics. Within minutes, statements were released across multiple platforms, press releases, interviews, and social media posts, characterized by a tone that was equal parts indignation and threat. This was not just about a business decision. For Trump, it was personal. The organization had been a cornerstone of his brand, wealth, and influence. Its forced dissolution felt to him like an attack on his legacy. Trump's messaging attempted to frame the ruling as politically motivated. He claimed repeatedly that the judiciary had overstepped, targeting him unfairly because of his political stature. In interviews, he emphasized the unprecedented nature of the dissolution, portraying himself as a victim of a biased system. Statements included phrases like witch hunt, targeted destruction, and unprecedented attack on a private business. At the same time, Trump sought to rally his base. He urged supporters to speak out, painting the decision as an assault on entrepreneurial freedom, American business values, and even national pride. His communications were carefully designed to elicit emotional reactions, anger, loyalty, and outrage, rather than measured reflection. It was a tactic that had served him well politically, leveraging controversy to dominate headlines and media cycles. Legal observers quickly weighed in on the tone and substance of Trump's response. While he questioned the legitimacy of the court's ruling, analysts noted that the actual text of the decision left very little room for reinterpretation. Appeals, they explained, would be difficult and unlikely to reverse the dissolution. Trump's rhetoric, they argued, was aimed more at perception than practical outcomes, a strategy to maintain influence, even as his business empire faced immediate dismantling. Internally, aides and advisors scrambled. Some pushed for calmer messaging, warning that aggressive language could backfire or attract additional legal scrutiny. Others encouraged the theatrics, recognizing that Trump's strength lay in commanding attention, dominating conversations, and framing every challenge as a personal battle. By the end of the day, the narrative was clear. Trump was defiant, his base was energized, and the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. But beneath the surface, the clock was ticking. Courts had issued a definitive mandate, and the process of dissolving the organization had begun, whether Trump liked it or not. The stage was set for a high-stakes clash between defiance and enforcement, with history watching every move. While Trump's immediate response dominated headlines, the political repercussions were equally explosive. Republican leaders, who had long navigated the delicate balance between loyalty and pragmatism, were suddenly forced to react to an event that few could have predicted. The dissolution of the Trump Organization was not just a business story, it was a seismic political moment, and every member of Congress had to consider how it would affect their careers, credibility, and relationship with the former president. Some Republican lawmakers scrambled to distance themselves from Trump's rhetoric, carefully framing their statements to acknowledge the court's authority while avoiding direct criticism of him personally. Moderate Republicans in swing districts, already wary of alienating constituents, expressed cautious support for the rule of law, emphasizing that the judicial system operates independently and that no one is above it. These statements, while measured, were significant. For many, it was the first time they publicly acknowledged that Trump's business empire could be held legally accountable. At the same time, staunch MAGA allies rallied to Trump's side, denouncing the Supreme Court decision as a politically motivated attack designed to weaken him. They framed the ruling as part of a broader pattern of elite institutions targeting conservative voices and conservative businesses, urging supporters to resist what they called an unfair system. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags supporting Trump trending alongside ones celebrating the court's decision, reflecting the stark divide within the party and across the nation. Behind closed doors, party strategists debated the implications for upcoming elections. The concern was twofold. Could Trump's defiance mobilize his base enough to sway Republican primaries, and would moderate Republicans risk losing credibility with voters by appearing to side against him? Some argued that remaining silent was no longer an option. Every lawmaker would be judged by their response. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders seized the opportunity to highlight accountability and the rule of law. They framed the dissolution as proof that legal institutions can act against power, even at the highest levels, and emphasized the importance of checks and balances in protecting democracy. Their messaging amplified the political stakes, making the unfolding saga not just about business or law, but about the broader direction of American governance. By the end of the day, Washington was in turmoil. Party lines were being tested, alliances questioned, and the very concept of political loyalty was under scrutiny. The Supreme Court's ruling had triggered a domino effect, one that was poised to reshape the political landscape for months, if not years, to come. Lawmakers, pundits, and voters alike were left grappling with a single question: how do you navigate a political world where one man's empire can fall overnight? While Trump's immediate response dominated headlines, the political repercussions were equally explosive. Republican leaders, who had long navigated the delicate balance between loyalty and pragmatism, were suddenly forced to react to an event that few could have predicted. The dissolution of the Trump Organization was not just a business story, it was a seismic political moment, and every member of Congress had to consider how it would affect their careers, credibility, and relationship with the former president. Some Republican lawmakers scrambled to distance themselves from Trump's rhetoric, carefully framing their statements to acknowledge the court's authority while avoiding direct criticism of him personally. Moderate Republicans in swing districts, already wary of alienating constituents, expressed cautious support for the rule of law, emphasizing that the judicial system operates independently and that no one is above it. These statements, while measured, were significant. For many, it was the first time they publicly acknowledged that Trump's business empire could be held legally accountable. At the same time, staunch MAGA allies rallied to Trump's side, denouncing the Supreme Court decision as a politically motivated attack designed to weaken him. They framed the ruling as part of a broader pattern of elite institutions targeting conservative voices and conservative businesses, urging supporters to resist what they called an unfair system. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags supporting Trump trending alongside one celebrating the court's decision, reflecting the stark divide within the party and across the nation. Behind closed doors, party strategists debated the implications for upcoming elections. The concern was twofold. Could Trump's defiance mobilize his base enough to sway Republican primaries, and would moderate Republicans risk losing credibility with voters by appearing to side against him? Some argued that remaining silent was no longer an option. Every lawmaker would be judged by their response. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders seized the opportunity to highlight accountability and the rule of law. They framed the dissolution as proof that legal institutions can act against power, even at the highest levels, and emphasized the importance of checks and balances in protecting democracy. Their messaging amplified the political stakes, making the unfolding saga not just about business or law, but about the broader direction of American governance. By the end of the day, Washington was in turmoil. Party lines were being tested, alliances questioned, and the very concept of political loyalty was under scrutiny. The Supreme Court's ruling had triggered a domino effect, one that was poised to reshape the political landscape for months, if not years, to come. Lawmakers, pundits, and voters alike were left grappling with a single question: how do you navigate a political world where one man's empire can fall overnight? As the news of the Supreme Court's ruling spread, the reaction was not limited to U.S. politics. Global markets, investors, and international observers quickly registered the significance of the Trump Organization's forced dissolution. Within hours, stocks tied to Trump-linked ventures and real estate holdings experienced sharp declines, with analysts scrambling to calculate the potential economic ripple effects. Financial news networks ran nonstop coverage, dissecting the short-term impacts on commercial and residential properties, lenders, and international partnerships. Wall Street's reaction was immediate and intense. Investment firms began reviewing exposure to assets connected to the organization, while bondholders evaluated the implications of potential defaults or liquidations. Some investors who had long viewed Trump-branded properties as premium or resilient were forced to reconsider risk profiles in real time. Market analysts emphasized that while the direct financial footprint of the Trump Organization might be small relative to the overall U.S. economy, the symbolic impact was enormous, shaking confidence in high-profile private enterprises led by politically prominent figures. International reactions followed quickly. In Europe, media outlets framed the ruling as a landmark in global business accountability, noting that even leaders with vast influence are not immune from legal scrutiny. Financial journalists in Asia highlighted potential impacts on partnerships, joint ventures, and the perception of U.S. markets as unpredictable or politically entangled. Investors and analysts debated whether this ruling would set a precedent for holding other prominent corporations accountable, particularly those with political ties.